The Sine Institute of Policy and Politics is American University's incubator for policy innovation. We convene leaders in the academic, public, private, nonprofit, and journalism sectors to engage and promote common ground and nonpartisan solutions. In an evolving world, we seize the opportunity to work on the nation's most pressing challenges through collaboration by experts and top scholars in their field with students in research and scholarship. As part of that goal, the Sine Institute leverages American University's location in our nation's capital, the nexus of government and a growing international business center. We connect diverse perspectives from around the country and around the world with our world-class academics and research, experienced practitioners, and the most politically active student body in the U.S. We stand apart through our focus on the role of business and the nonprofit community in public policy, the rise of the importance of economic regions in the United States, and international policy issues. Our focus is to make an immediate impact at the intersection of policy and politics that leads to real and lasting change. Thank you for joining us as we convene, communicate, and collaborate. Join Sine Institute's Executive Director, Amy Dacey, with author Paul Laudicina as we navigate his book, Roadmap to a Brighter Future.
Well, welcome everyone. We're so glad to have you here today. It's Amy Dacey for our discussion, A Roadmap to a Brighter Future. We are excited to have Paul join us today. We're actually honored because he has a long history of really breaking down tough policy issues, of working with CEOs and public elected officials to make change. And just quickly, Paul is Chairman Emeritus of Kearney, one of the world's largest strategy consulting firms, and founder of its Global Business Policy Council, a top-rated think tank, helping CEOs, as I said, government, civil society leaders anticipate the rise to the challenge of navigating a transformed world. But also, Paul, earlier in his career, he served as then Senator Joe Biden's legislative director and as a founder of the policy division of SRI International. And I will say that the book, you can tell I've read it, and I'm excited to bring Paul on. President Biden even commented on the book that, Paul, I've had the distinct privilege of knowing you for most of your professional lifetime. You have always had remarkable ability to translate complicated policy questions into clear and compelling propositions that average Americans can understand. Ladies and gentlemen, we are joined now by Paul Laudicina, author of Roadmap to a Brighter Future. And we are so excited to have you here today. I think Paul will have you run through some of the main themes of the book, and then we'll get into some questions together.
Thanks very much, Amy. It's a delight to be with you, especially given the extraordinarily important mission of the Sine Institute of Policy and Politics today more than ever. And that's really what this book, Roadmap to a Brighter Future, is all about. So I'd like to share with you for the time that we have available some ideas that are reflected in the book and then to be, of course, available for questions and engage in dialogue with you about the themes of the book. So much of the scholarship that we have seen over the last few years has tried and done a pretty good job of dissecting the state of the world and has focused on describing and analyzing why the US and the world is in the kind of sorry state of affairs that we often find ourselves in, and the precarious situation that we are in today. And I think, you know, with the converging existential crises that we see all around us, it's easy to simply sit back and spend your time and being content with what I like to call admiring the fire. But this book doesn't sugarcoat the nature and gravity of the challenges that are facing us. But at the same time, it moves quickly from the diagnostic to the prescriptive, state, and discusses the way to what I believe is the exit ramp to a brighter future. And that's what I want to share with you some ideas with today before we get to the Q&A. So there is, of course, one past I'm fond of saying, and one present, but there are multiple possible futures. And the two images that you see here, which, by the way, all of the images in this short PowerPoint presentation are images taken from the book. These two images that you see are, a reflection of how things can change. And here you see, within the space of a mere 14 days, the same setting that we had on January 6th of this year, an attempted insurrection, and then 2 weeks later, in precisely the same location, we saw the peaceful transfer of power to the 46th president of the United States. So things have and can still, in my view, change for the better, but only if we are pretty clear-eyed about the future and determined, as we have been throughout other challenging periods of history, to shape the future to good outcomes. And that's why I wrote this book. And I think that there are two words that best characterize why I wrote this book, and they are urgency and agency. And so I want to talk a little bit first about the urgency. It's easy to understand if you look at these four converging crises, the unprecedented level of anxiety and the mental health challenges that we've seen in the course of recent years, which have only gotten worse during the last 2 years almost of the pandemic, especially among younger Americans. And as this caption states, our recent historical interlude hasn't been especially pretty. So if we just quickly, and the book spends some time, of course, parsing out each of these converging crises, but the first, public health, I needn't say much about this greatest challenge to public health surely in our lifetimes. We have experienced the largest one-year decline in US life expectancy since World War II as a result of the pandemic. We've gone from 78.8 to 77.3 years of life expectancy. That's a decline of 1.5 years just over the course of the last 2 years. Climate change, as you see evidence of in this photo in the bottom left-hand corner, clearly devastating economic and human loss from severe weather, which is a result of man's impact on the environment. And by the way, parenthetically, if you haven't had a chance yet to see your own AU museum exhibit on climate change, the Diane Burko exhibition, I encourage you to do so. It's truly incredible. But we all have seen evidence of drought, of wildfires, of floods, and air pollution, which alone, air pollution globally, takes more than 7 million lives and costs the global economy over $5 trillion a year. So the second converging crisis, the top right-hand column shows the economic crisis, which is, of course, not unrelated, but was also a pre-existing condition before the pandemic hit. And then finally, in the bottom right, we see the manifestation of racial injustice and unrest, which has followed in its wake. And any one of these crises would be enough to challenge us in a fundamental way, but with all four converging at the same time and feeding into one another in many ways, this should create, without a question, a sense of urgency. But at the same time, the second word is the word of agency. And to me, this addresses the question of how do we and how should we engage in trying to re-engineer or reverse the kind of system inertia which we've seen, and address the crises, those four converging crises, to create a brighter future. And here we see four manifestations of different generational cohorts that we're all familiar with. Top left, of course, we see the Depression era generation. Top right, we see the World War II or GI generation. Bottom left is the baby boomer generation, and bottom right is the current generational cohorts, now the largest generational cohorts in the US, Gens X and Y. And the quote here in the top left corner of the slide, history creates generations and generations create history, are from the demographers Neil Howe and his late colleague William Strauss in their landmark book Generations, in which they said that generational attitudes and behaviors are shaped by the historical circumstances that a given generation finds itself in, and the times in which they live. And in turn, each generational cohort's behavior shapes the course of history. So history creating generations, generations creating history. And it's this sense of agency that I believe falls squarely on the shoulders of the nearly 51% of Americans comprising Gens Y and Z, many of you on this call today, that'll help determine whether or not we have that kind of brighter future, which previous generational cohorts, when presented with the challenges of their day, ushered in actions that dealt with the Great Depression, that addressed the circumstances of World War II and its aftermath, and the great social upheavals, of course, that I am personally, given the fact that I'm a boomer, are more familiar with personally from the 1960s and 70s. So Gens Y and Z have matured and are maturing in periods of unresolved upheaval and seeming institutional stagnation and incapacity. And this is the generational experience that could indelibly stamp the next period of history in not very favorable ways. And to me, this is the biggest challenge that we face and society faces today. Will we allow this kind of crucible of history, this incapacity to deal with these existential crises which are converging, become the indelible stamp that forms Gen Y and Z and the country and the world that you all, those of you of that generation on this call, will be forced to live with and lead in? That is the big challenge. So let's get into very quickly what's holding us back and how do we get here, the diagnostic stage. And then after the Q&A, we'll spend a little time talking about the prescriptive stage. So what's holding us back here? I think that there are, again, two words that best can characterize the circumstances which underlie the situation that we're in today. And those are inequality, certainly reflected in this image of a modern day Los Angeles, with in the same scene we have homeless sheltering on the street in the shadow of gleaming high-rises not far in the distance, demonstrating this inequality that we see. And of course, the second word that I'll get to in a minute is misology. But if we just start with the first word, I mean, we all know that today we have greater inequality in wealth than at any time in the last 50 years in this country. Today, just as one illustration, factual illustration of that, the bottom 50% of earners in the United States, that's 165 million Americans, hold about $2 trillion in wealth as of Q2 last year. The same amount, $2 trillion of wealth, that's held by the 50 richest Americans. Clearly, that's a divide that cannot be sustained. And during the pandemic, this has all gotten worse. In fact, one illustration of that is that during the pandemic, we have minted one new billionaire every 17 hours, while much of the country was struggling to survive, literally struggling to survive. So this divide, this pernicious widening gap and the sense of hopelessness that it has helped spawn, has flamed these flames, has fanned these flames of socio-political toxic populism and nativism impulses that we've seen not just at home, but also abroad. And this in turn leads me to the second word, misology, perhaps a word that many of you are not familiar with. It's one that goes back to Socrates, who used it, and it means the hatred of or rejection of reasoning or enlightenment. And so we have no hope of understanding, let alone embracing the right options for the future, if we don't return to a fact and science-based method of decision-making across all walks of life, not just in politics, to be sure. And this is something that we need to do ourselves, and we need to demand it of our leaders, which gets me to the next slide before we stop for the Q&A, which is why I believe optimism is not pie in the sky, Pollyannish. I believe that if you look through the annals of history that we've been through, even recent history, we've managed to navigate through dire circumstances before, oftentimes against all odds, and managed to chart roadmaps to brighter futures than the ones that seem to loom largest on the horizon at the time. Here in this imagery, we see 9/11. The World Trade Center obviously had disappeared from the scene. And then some years later, the phoenix literally from the ashes here, where we see how we have recovered and the new hope that is associated with the very same scene, much like the scene that I began with, January 6th versus January 20th. And if you look back through modern history, from Lincoln leading us back after we were a country torn apart by the Civil War with 600,000 Americans who lost their lives in that war, or the New Deal as the antidote to the Great Depression, and then fast forward to more modern divisions from the Vietnam War to urban riots in the 60s and assassinations, the struggle for civil rights, the trauma of Watergate. We have outlived those obituaries, and we've emerged from each and every one of them stronger and wiser than ever. And I believe we can do it again if we're seized by the urgency to act, and if we assume the agency to do so. So with that, I'd like to just kind of stop here, Amy, and leave it to you to engineer some questions and get into a discussion before we talk about some of the prescriptions.
Absolutely. Well, Paul, thank you.
Can't hear you, Amy.
Oh,
there we go. Gotcha now.
Paul, is I've had the opportunity to read the book, and just a reminder for the students that signed up today, we've had a generous contribution of the books, and we're making them available. We also have some at sign for others that are interested. You've done an incredible job walking us, through the main, points of this book, and I think your pictures certainly line up so well with and create such a visual for the conversation. And I think it's good that we're talking about optimism, but I will say in chapter 2, you mentioned that globalization and technological revolution benefited some, but left many behind. So my first question to you is, how do we level that playing field? Do we even want to? How does that seems one of the first steps you have to think through in this evolution?
Yeah. Look, I think, Amy, that's a great question. We absolutely have to level the playing field. All of the big challenges that we face today and the opportunities are cross-border. Whether it's climate change and public health, or whether it's advancing and using technologies to feed the world, or whether it's the trade and financial intermediation that comes from cross-border commercial activities, they can't be addressed by any one nation. They have to be addressed globally. And one of the biggest challenges that COVID has really turbocharged is this division between those of us, as Donnie Roderick of Harvard calls us, the global minority, who've been able to leverage policy liberalization and technology on the one hand, versus the immobile majority most of the rest of the world that's been outside the bakery window looking in. That's what's created this inequality, which has been the animus for the toxic socio-political environment. And that's what needs to be bridged if we're going to be able to realize the kinds of opportunities that lie ahead of us. And I think that there are a lot of ways that we can use technology effectively. If you look at the so-called fourth industrial revolution technologies, from artificial intelligence to 3D manufacturing to robotics and so forth, those technologies create the promise for generating incredible wealth, which could be shared more equitably to have the rising tide bring us all up, because otherwise we're forced, as I wrote in a previous book, to live in a world of castles and moats, where the rich live up on the hill and the rest of the world is, looking at those disparities. That's not sustainable. And technology gives us the promise to solve those problems if we use it properly.
Well, that kind of leads me to my next question, though. Some of these disparities, it seems in our two-party system, there's very different approaches to this. And the polarization that we're experiencing, especially at the national level, there is some collaboration that you see in the local and state level, but especially in recent, events, this inability to come together to solve solutions. Can the roadmap be a bipartisan endeavor? Where do you see us coming together on some of these key elements in an environment where some might say it's too toxic to try and move this forward?
Yeah, the curious thing, Amy, and that's really the key question that I'm sure a lot of the listeners have. Mm-hmm. Why can you be optimistic when any night you turn on the news, you see gridlock and incapacity, and you see wider and wider divisions? And what gives me hope for that, Amy, is we did a series some years ago in another research initiative I was in, of focus groups around the country with different generational cohorts, boomers, Xers, and millennials. And we did some very intensive national opinion sampling. The simple fact of the matter is the American people are better than those who are leading them. Oftentimes, if you asked Americans, as we did, what their opinions were on gender equity, on racial equity, on questions that relate to climate change, on questions that relate to growth, opportunities, Americans wanted to choose the right prescriptions, even on immigration issues. But somehow, on the way to the forum, that gets translated into political jockeying, which creates much more division and toxicity, largely around people not being as forthcoming about the facts associated with the consequences of not arriving at the right decisions. So Americans don't have a question about what the right thing to do is. The questions they have is, are we capable of doing the right things? And I think that's why this period, and that's why I wrote this book, this period of the next couple of years is absolutely critical, because unless and until we can show that our political leadership can, in fact, make the kinds of decisions that will address those converging crises and move us to a brighter future, then we will be relegated to live one of the alternative futures that I talk about in the book, which is clearly not a favorable one.
Well, it's interesting. We've had some great conversations leading up to our event today. And one of the things you actually mentioned to me is that it was COVID that created an environment where you could sit down and actually write this book. But I mean, is this huge, we've had three things happening at the same time. We've had a global pandemic, we've had this economic crisis, and then we've had social, unrest in the United States. Like, are all these three factors really pushing and driving this conversation and making this book possible? As you said, you actually put pen to paper during this time.
Yeah, I think, Amy, that I like to say, based on my experience of working with companies and government as well as individuals, that oftentimes breakdowns are the greatest impetus for breakthroughs. The cathartic impetus of any one of these crises should be enough prompting us to act. But when you see them all converging together, they really should provide the impetus for us to do the right thing. I think the American public is confused because of the misology, the renunciation of reason and logic, and the abnegation of fact. And as a result, the course has been somewhat muddled. And I don't think we can leave it to national political leaders alone to chart the right course. I think this has got to be a generational push. It's got to be a bottom up as much as it is top down. And if you look at other previous periods of crisis, when this has happened, look at just the 60s and 70s. We had governments that were non-responsive to the popular will. And there was an outpouring of sentiment led by young people that, if you will, from the movie, we're mad as hell and we're not going to take it anymore, that changed the system. Not sufficiently, but certainly created a sense of optimism and engagement about, where positive engagement can lead us. And we need that same sense of urgency and agency today with the generation, the 50.6% of Americans who are in Gen X and Y. Look, it's those generational cohorts that are going to have to live with the mess that we have created. And so therefore, they need to be seized with and responsible for, in part, charting that new course.
Well, I think it's important. I will say that, we do have an environment right now where there's been a recent leadership change on the national level. So my question for you would be, you've worked for President Biden. You certainly know him well. Do you feel he shares this vision for a roadmap for a brighter future? Where do you see the elements? We've passed 100 days, the first 100 days, right? We've just seen this big infrastructure bill pass. Where do you see those elements in action right now?
Yeah, well, of course, number one, I can
know it's the university. I'm not going to ask you to grade him, but maybe if you like.
Look, I think number one, he is an inveterate optimist. I remember I worked in the Iowa caucuses back, in January, February of 2020. And it was a dismal outcome for Joe Biden. And again, in New Hampshire and Nevada, he was virtually the only person in the room that thought he really had a chance and in fact was convinced that he would win. And I remember one conversation with him, which went something like, winning the nomination is going to be difficult. Mm-hmm. Winning the presidency is going to be more difficult, and governing is going to be the most difficult. And that certainly has been the case. But I know he shares this vision. In fact, I had the opportunity in a previous version of this vision to brief him on it. I think he does this kind of sharp pencil exercise of where are we headed, where do we want to be headed, and what do we need to do to get there. I think the infrastructure bill, the hard infrastructure bill that was signed into law, is the beginning of that kind of initiative that needs to be taken. There will be other things that need to be done. So I think he himself is disappointed that the ball hasn't moved more quickly than it has. But COVID has been more tenacious than anyone expected. Public resistance to following the science has been more resistant than we expected. The supply chain issues have persisted in part because COVID has persisted. And these things have conspired to create an environment of sort of pessimism about whether or not we can succeed to implement the kind of agenda which he was elected with, more votes than anyone in history before. So I think I am optimistic that we can get there, but it's going to be tough sledding, and he's not going to get there just from the top down. It's got to be bottom up as well, and that's what this book is all about.
Well, it's interesting because one of, I genuinely love in this book your 10 propositions for America. But one of my favorite is a reinvigorated public service.
Yeah.
And you're talking about a leadership at the top that's had decades and decades devoted to public service. But I think it's important to share with our audience today, why is it so important to have
Yeah.
a reinvigorated, public service? Why is that one of the main tenets that you're talking about?
Well, look, I think we've seen just with the crises that we've been dealing with, the public health crisis, to be sure, addressing climate change and so forth, that in order to address these kinds of problems, it takes real competence and it takes people with experience. Thomas Edison used to say that vision without execution is hallucination. And so in order to be able to succeed in all of these areas, we have to have effective execution that comes from the best and the brightest having their hand at the helm. And I like to say, to build trust, honesty, which I think most people give Joe Biden, even his opponents, high marks for honesty. Honesty is table stakes. Saying what you mean and meaning what you say is table stakes for engendering trust. You also have to demonstrate that you're capable of delivering on what you promise and that you reliably do so. And so I think having a government institutional capacity that is both honest, capable, and reliable, which comes from experience, capable public service, is critical. And that's why I mention it. It's one of the 10 propositions for a brighter future.
Excellent. Well, I will say that you do share 4 distinct visions for the future of America. Does one of those exist in today's reality, or what is the ideal? I mean,
well, the curious thing is when we did focus groups about this and we put the different visions of America up on the screen and we asked people which vision of America did they think we were in. First of all, there was unanimity about which vision they wished to navigate to, and that was the top right, most favorable vision, which I call an all-American comeback. But when we asked them where they thought we were presently, they actually were much more negative, thinking that we were either in the bottom left quadrant, which we'll talk about in a minute, what I call dollar store America, where things really do not go well at all, or in the bottom right, which I call tech lords rule, which is where we continue to experience vibrant economic growth, but very inequitably distributed. And so most people thought we were either in the bottom left or bottom right unfavorable environment, but wanted to move to the top right, much more favorable environment, which is a function of the drivers that I'll talk about when we close.
Absolutely. Well, I have to tell you, Paul, already we're getting questions from the audience. I have more, but I want to pepper those in because I don't want to not get to them.
Sure.
Just a reminder that you please submit your questions on the Q&A function. I know you're not shy, so there's a lot to ask Paul. One of our first questions comes from a student I know well, Tyler, who always asks really great questions. He's been a student associate here at the Sign Institute and has worked with us. What can average Americans do to make the future brighter when Congress is so divided and isn't acting on behalf of the people?
Yeah, look, I think it's a great question. And I think it's really all about demanding that decisions are based upon fact and science. Decisions at every level, decisions in your university, decisions in your local town and community, decisions in your union, decisions in whatever civil society organizations you might be involved in, absolute adherence to fact over fiction, and rigorous, research into what the fact base needs to be. Secondly, I'd say get involved. Don't think the only way you need to be involved is waiting every 4 years to pull the lever for one or another presidential candidate. Most of the real positive action that's taking place these days is taking place at the local level. In fact, I wrote a paper some years ago called The Age of Multi-Localism. And I think if you just look at climate change and you look at the 500 plus mayors that previously endorsed, the Paris Climate Accord and so forth. And if you look even at the corporate sector, the private sector, and the decisions that they've been taking related to sustainability and climate change, and increasingly around the whole ESG formula of environmental, social, and governance, initiatives. Purpose drives performance. Performance is the outcome of pursuing the right kind of purpose, which is based upon principle and a vision for the future. And so I think every individual needs to take responsibility within their sphere of influence. That means with families and friends. Look, pretty soon we're all going to be around 1 week from today, the Thanksgiving table.
Yeah.
Probably a lot of our families will have a white flag outside the door that says no politics discussed. Yeah. And I understand and I applaud that. But the point is, we need to work with our family and friends to be sure that they understand in as dispassionate and rational a way as possible what the fact and science-based sort of clarity should be that needs to guide how we behave and act. And every leader at every level, and I challenge corporate leaders every day to use their platform on these kinds of questions to be able that the people, to know that the people that they work with and look up to them also understand that they're being guided by principle and fact in the decisions that they're making.
You mentioned localized, and there's another great question that I've gotten that asks the question, though, we're a big country. There's 50 states, territories, urban, rural, regional, certainly different ethnicities, race, gender. We celebrate our diversity, but with all this diversity, are you able to come together? Is there interests that are common with a roadmap when you talk about localized community or individual voters?
Well, but I mean, that's the point. That's the burning platform, Amy. I mean, we have, no matter what the divide, whether it's by generation, whether it's by gender, whether it's by political orientation, when you talk about these converging crises, when you talk about public health, when you talk about climate change, when you talk about economic disparity. In fact, the interesting thing is, issues about economic disparity are as much an animus for the left wing of the Democratic Party as they are for the right wing of the Republican Party. And so I think absolutely we're all in this together. This is a zero-sum game. We either get it right and we all win, or we get it wrong and we all lose. And I think we need that kind of all-party agreement about how we proceed. And I'm pretty hopeful that when you do the sharp pencil exercise and you talk with people about the factual basis for where we're headed, and they determine, gee, that's not where I wish to go or I want my family to go, then you start talking about, okay, what are the alternative paths to a brighter future? And that's how you galvanize the support that's necessary across all divides to get there.
Okay, well, even as we have those conversations, as we find a unified response in the we that we talk about here in the United States, you do mention and make a big point that we don't live in a vacuum. So what is happening internationally certainly impacts this vision. Can we build this roadmap with the external forces you mentioned in the book, like China and Russia and India especially, and those factors that play into decisions we're making domestically?
Look, I think we need a global New Deal. The Bretton Woods institutions, which served us well, designed after World War II to ensure that we would avoid the path to a world war in the future, have until late really allowed us to realize the great promise and advances of the last 50 years. But those institutions have grown tired and frankly unable to address some of the bigger questions of the day that are much more associated with the digital transformation that we've gone through and all of the new technologies that have created lots of white space and the need for lots of different ways of coming to agreement. The interesting thing is these converging existential crises affect all of us. They affect, water availability, drought, and resources in, the Siberian hinterland, as they do around the Ganges. and certainly as they do in virtually what we see in terms of the impact of pollution in China. I think there is much more global cohesiveness around the need to address these kinds of problems. I think the US needs to reassume its position of leadership, but we cannot do that credibly unless we start solving our own domestic problems. And that's why this book begins with and spends most of its time addressing the question of how do we reform the US environment so that we can, as Joe Biden likes to say, lead by the power of our example rather than the example of our power. And I think when we do those things and demonstrate to the world that democratic institutions can in fact work and address effectively the needs of the public across all divides, that will become the basis for us to work more closely with our allies and adversaries to see to it that we jointly address these problems, because they cannot be addressed by individual countries alone.
No, and it's you've mentioned there's this interconnected tissue with us domestically, but also internationally. And it's interesting how we think in the future about what borders really are, to do that. But I think also some of our traditional threats have been around war, around the physical, around the threat of certainly, between countries, and we've responded to the challenge. We think about, the wars that we faced, but there's this, you also mention, not along with some of these international forces, the mention of the cyber threat, and certainly misinformation. Why is the cyber threat such an important piece in this puzzle? And how do you bring that into the solution side, to the glass half full piece of it?
Yeah, I think, clearly the great, what we have experienced and seen through COVID has been, as others have said, the triumph of science in the development in record time of effective vaccines that can address COVID. At the same time, the failure of leadership. And we have this kind of paradox that we have we're on the cusp of tremendous breakthroughs in science in the fourth industrial revolution technologies, so-called artificial intelligence, 3D manufacturing, robotics, on and on. Biotechnology. There's an incredible series of breakthroughs that we're on the cusp of, but unless we are able to use technology effectively, guided by principle, with normative behavior, providing the guardrails for how we interact across borders, we'll never be able to realize that potential. And I think increasingly, foreign governments outside the US, understand as well as we do that the big opportunities and threats are all around cyber. I think that the competition, as you see around 5G, the question about data transfers and how one manages data transfers, we need to have a series of global cyber agreements, because nobody is safe if we have marauding bands of cyber criminals without fingerprints being able to impede commerce and invade our physical as well as financial security any place in the world. So yeah, cyber is both the promise and the potential peril that we need to address effectively. And that's why we're in such a critical period of history, which demands fact and science-based decision-making.
It's interesting, you mentioned this as one of the big perils. A question that was submitted by a student ahead of the program I thought was really insightful. They said, is another peril that, we have leadership changes, we're a democracy, and we have elections, and, we've got a midterm coming up, and you see the Democrats in control right now of the House and Senate. What are you able to accomplish? And the presidency as you're moving forward. We've got a very contested midterm. I think you've already seen Kevin McCarthy, and the Republicans say these are the things we change. With that, and rightly so, everyone elects their leaders, but with those changes, how do you find a way to keep this moving forward and not see setbacks or changes, every time there is an election here in the United States?
Yeah, and I here again, I think we focus as we should on the quality of our leadership, but we also need to be focused on the quality of followership. And when leaders don't deliver, then followers need to ensure that we change leaders who can deliver. I think the worst of all worlds, Amy, and for our questioner, is that we give up on being able to address and solve our problems. We just assume these are intractable problems. Our system is incapable of addressing them. So I'm going to simply tug at my own end of the blanket. And all I can say is, if you look back again at history, different periods of history, we were seemingly hopelessly divided around the Vietnam War. We were hopelessly divided in the Civil War. The circumstances that led to the Great Depression and what followed in its wake were, really quite dire. And you can just look across any series of historical documents about other countries in those periods of history. So, yes, politicians will change. What we've seen is forward movement on a lot of these issues subterraneously. I think we need a new social compact. I think business, government, labor, and civil society need to sit around the table and understand that we're headed in the wrong direction, and we all will lose if we don't change directions. And it means that we're all going to have to give something in the process in order to get back what we need to be able to meet that challenge. And so I'm as concerned about the quality or lack thereof of the national political dialogue and of the internecine warfare between parties. I served in the Senate, you served in government. I've never seen anything like this in my lifetime. But I go back and read about where we were just prior to the Civil War and after. And obviously, none of us want to see another civil war. But I think these are issues which must and can be addressed if we demand better from our politicians. But none of that's going to happen in an era of mythology. We have to demand fact and science guide our decision making. And I think fundamentally, all of us need to take responsibility for that.
Yeah. And I want to give you the opportunity for the vision ahead, but we have one final question that I think is important that came through, that is kind of in response to, as you mentioned, we've been divided in these big moments in time. And they said, we seem more divided than ever over literally a pandemic that we should be coming together around. And it's interesting because one of the things that really hit me when I read this book is you said pandemics remake the world. They have so how is the question is like, if we're so divided and this, how can this division around a health issue that it seems like we should be able to come together, and how is it going to remake, the
Well,
world?
I think we exaggerate the divisions around the pandemic. If you look at the percentages of Americans who are fully vaccinated and who do understand the gravity of the current public health crisis and understand and appreciate the science that are guiding decisions that are being made and need to be made, there's more alignment than there is division. But we always focus, of course, on that percentage of the public that is capable of thwarting the will of the majority. And I think particularly in a public health pandemic setting, it is especially pernicious because as long as the virus keeps circulating at home and abroad, it has the ability to evade and elude the best solutions that science can throw at it. So, I, at the beginning of the pandemic, was hopeful that it would provide this final cathartic push to allow people to think more about science-based decision-making. And for much of America, and certainly even more of the world, that's been the case. And I believe that will continue to be the case if, in fact, if leadership can demonstrate that they're leading honestly based on principle, that they are doing so capably, and that they can reliably deliver on what they promise. And that's what we're going to see. That's where the rubber will meet the road over the course of the next year or so, prior to the midterm elections. And if, in fact, we do make the right decisions and are able, even if not with an overwhelming majority. Look, when FDR was elected president of the United States, the Republican right thought that he was a socialist wacko, and the Democratic left thought he was a patrician. Winston Churchill, when he became prime minister, this was someone who most people thought had failed in every previous leadership incarnation he had had. He was fond of, his alcohol. He never really was a successful student, and people didn't give him much hope to lead. Abraham Lincoln, if you read the story of 13 days to the presidency, and so forth, the fact of the matter is most people thought that he was a very implausible and not likely to succeed leader. So we can overcome even a lot of the doubt as we begin putting points on the scoreboard, which I hope we'll be doing over the coming months to make the right decisions.
Well, I want to give you the opportunity for the look ahead, Paul, because I have to say, reading this book, understanding the history, seeing where we've been, all of us, I think, at some point, some things have seemed overwhelming. But I really would love for you to turn to, so what lies ahead and what's possible. I think that's what I really appreciate about this book. And certainly for the audience that we have today and those that are going to be watching in the future and will be able to get a copy of your book, they're going to want to know what's the path forward. So please,
Sure.
if you will.
Thank you, Amy. Happy to do that, and pleased to have had this opportunity to answer some questions and focus on that future. So we talked about why optimism is not Pollyannish, and I think now I'd like to sort of focus on a little bit on these four visions. I mean, fundamentally, I believe that we are not hostages to some preordained future. It's this. We have one past and one present, but multiple possible alternative futures. And we have to be enablers of the future that we want for ourselves and our children, just as previous generational cohorts did that in their historical circumstances. But in order to do that effectively, and here I'm drawing upon my experience of many, many years, many decades of working with institutions that were looking to change, looking for transformation. By looking through the kaleidoscope of plausible alternative futures, you can bring into focus the future that you wish to chart so that you can hopefully make the right decisions to get you there. And here, I think the best way to try and galvanize support to move toward that future, the upper right-hand quadrant here, what I call the all-American comeback, in which I discuss at some length in the book, is to have a dialogue about understanding the consequences of failing to make the decisions that move you in the right direction. And we talked, Amy, in the Q&A a little bit about where Americans think we are. They think we're either in tech lords rule in the bottom right or in a dollar store America in the bottom left. But the simple fact of the matter is, in my view, the only way we could move to the top right quadrant, and I discuss what the circumstances are of the all-American comeback, which is sustained growth that is shared more equitably throughout society with this rising tide lifting all of us, versus tech lord rules, which is high growth but unevenly distributed, or a dollar store America, which is low growth and division and all of the negative consequences associated with that, versus the top left, the fair shake, which is slower growth but more equitably distributed. All of those possibilities are driven by these two drivers of the future, and that is inclusiveness on the one hand. Can we ensure that the decisions we make are inclusive and equitable? And will they, on the other hand, as you see here on the axis across the x-axis here, is innovation and growth. Will we make decisions that will enable innovation and unleash the forces of technology for the common good? And will they be decisions that will allow for more equitable distribution of growth? So those are essentially the four alternatives that I talk about. And when we look through this prism with focus groups of Americans around the country and ask questions in survey data, it was clear that Americans wanted to navigate toward the all-American comeback and wanted to make and were prepared to make the right decisions to get there, but were afraid that our leaders were failing us and we were falling back to tech lords rule or a dollar store America. And in the interest of time, I can't say much more about them other than that I think this is an important exercise to go through to get the kind of support we need to make the right decisions to move us in the right direction. And so that kind of brings me to the final slide of the presentation, which is really a call to action. And I've been sort of providing this call to action, I hope, throughout the course of this presentation. But I believe fundamentally that we can create the future that we want to live in. And so I conclude with this call to action, especially to younger Americans. First, because you're going to be the beneficiaries of the decisions that are taken today. And second, because you're the largest generational cohort in the country. You're 51% of the country. And right now, you're not sharing equitably in the benefits of the growth that we've experienced over the last 20 plus years. And in fact, are sharing in less of the economic attainment that's been generated than previous generational cohorts did when they were your age. So you need to take charge. And I think, like previous generations caught in these crucibles of history, you need to do that by demanding fact-based decision-making and leadership. And we talked about this already in the Q&A. That means at every level of engagement, among family and friends, in the classroom, with civil society organizations that you might be involved in, local civic activities, community-based activities, in whatever job environment that you might be involved. Demand that decisions be illuminated and guided by fact and principle, and for sure, demand that of your leaders. And then, of course, finally, I end with this question of the need for a new deal. We need to understand, and I think when we look through the prism of the alternative futures, we should understand that this is absolutely one of the rare moments in history where doing good and doing well intersect, and that there is no way a corporate player or a labor leader or an individual leader in civil society or an average citizen can succeed unless we make the kinds of decisions that are in the best interest of all of us. And so, as Amy alluded in the presentation, I spend some time going through 10 propositions, which I think are absolutely doable and which, curiously, most of the American public support, that I believe provide this kind of roadmap to a brighter future. And this book is all about letting us understand that we need to be seized by the urgency of taking charge, and that we need to, each in our own way, ensure that we do the right thing, which will redound to the benefit of all of us. And so that's all I have to share with you today, Amy. I would welcome anyone that wishes to raise questions after the forum. Feel free to be in touch with me. I can be contacted just through paul.laudicina.com or paul-laudicina.com. and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. So thank you for giving me this opportunity, Amy. Much, much appreciated.
Well, Paul, we thank you for your time, and I have to say that, you know, for the students that joined us today, we're making the book available to them, and we'll get to them. We also are going to make sure that our entire network has the recording that we did of this, you know, event today. If people on here want to share this with their peers, or if they want to contact us to try and make sure this opportunity reaches some others, we're going to do that. We're going to continue the conversation and make sure that the community at American University and certainly the Sign Institute have access to this conversation. And we will certainly in our newsletter promote how to get the book and how to get in touch with you, you know, to further that conversation. And Paul, the last thing is I love this virtual conversation with you. You are welcome when you are back on the East Coast to come to AU, and we'll do a follow-up with some of our students. But this is a really important piece of work at such a critical time. And I want to thank you. I personally learned a lot, and I am optimistic about this roadmap. And I would encourage everybody to go to the Sign Institute's website. We have a new group of fellows coming and joining us in the spring. Many of them are going to be working on these issues that you talked about, Paul. So it's incredibly timely. We have opportunities for students to become student associates, to get involved. So please stay in touch. And Paul, we're going to stay in touch with you and get the follow-up. I know you're always working on things, and this will evolve. So we will definitely do that. It's been an honor to have you here with us today, and I look forward to staying in touch with you in the future. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Amy. Much appreciated.
Take care.
Bye-bye.